Right, why don't we start the program? Sapna?
Great, thank you, Michael. Good afternoon. I'm Sapna Pala, immediate past president of AABANY and partner at Wigan and Dana. On behalf of AABANY, I welcome all of you to our program today, The Surge in Anti-Asian Violence, Corporate Social Responsibility and Action. The last year has been especially difficult for the AAPI community, as many of us, our families and friends, have had to confront the ugly nature of the violence and hatred hurled towards us. AABANY has been at the forefront since March 2020, working on many fronts to urge government, law enforcement, and community leaders to take action and to educate and assist our communities to assert their rights. AABANY and Paul Weiss's report, A Rising Tide of Hate and Violence Against Asian Americans in New York During COVID-19, has been at the forefront of bringing attention to these issues and proposing solutions to address it. Today, our distinguished panel of corporate in-house leaders will address corporate social responsibility in the face of anti-Asian violence and discuss what corporations can do to address it. I would like to thank each of our panelists for the many hours devoted to putting this panel together and for their leadership, both within and outside their organizations in addressing anti-Asian violence. I would also like to thank Sandra Yamate, CEO, Institute for Inclusion in the Legal Profession, for organizing this panel, and Bonnie Yoon at the RMN agency and on the GABABA board for putting together the impactful and educational slide deck that you will see today. Finally, I want to thank the over 70 bar associations who have joined with AABANY today to co-sponsor this program and for reaching all of you across the country. I will now turn it over to Judy Lamb, partner at Maynard Cooper and Secretary of NABABA, to provide the all-important CLE information, and thank her and NABABA for all their assistance in putting together this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Sapna. The Asian American Bar Association of New York is certified by the New York State Continuing Legal Education Board as an accredited provider. This program has been approved in accordance with the requirements of the CLE board for a maximum of 1.5 credit hours, in which 1.5 credit hours will be applied towards the diversity and inclusion requirement. This program is suitable for non-transitional New York attorneys only. Transitional New York attorneys will not receive credit. You must have pre-registered and confirmed for this program to receive CLE credit. And of course, you must attend. The first page of the written materials that were mailed to you is an attorney affirmation. You must complete that and return it to cle@aabany.org. 2 codes will be announced during this program. Record the codes on the attorney affirmation and return your affirmation as soon as possible within 1 week so that we can send you your certificate. You will have received a link for an online evaluation for this session with the written materials. You must complete that evaluation to receive CLE credit. So please complete the attorney affirmation and the evaluation, even if you are not licensed in New York, and that will facilitate receiving credit in other jurisdictions. The program is being recorded for archival purposes. Your continued attendance in this program constitutes your consent to transmit, record, and use your voice and image for this purpose. And now there are some states that have co-sponsored, some bars that are co-sponsored and are securing CLE for attendance from those states, while others will still have to use the New York Certificate of Attendance from AABANY to apply in their own state, and AABANY can help to facilitate that. CLE has been approved in these states: California, Colorado, New York, British Columbia, and Ontario, Canada, and applied for in Florida, Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Hawaii, Missouri, Minnesota, and Tennessee. AABANY will assist anyone seeking reciprocity or self-study in their home states. And now for a rousing thank you to our supporters and sponsors across the country, across Canada, and even in the UK. Bear with me, as this is a large and tremendous and impressive list. The Association of Corporate Counsel in the following areas: Arizona, Baltimore, Boston, Central Ohio, Chicago, Colorado, Dallas-Fort Worth, Georgia, Greater Philadelphia, Michigan, Mid-America, Minnesota, Mountain West, New Jersey, New York, Northeast, Ontario, Oregon, San Francisco Bay Area, Southern California, Southwest Ohio, San Diego, South Florida, and Western Pennsylvania. AABA, Greater Bay Area. AABA, Kansas City. Asian Bar Association of Washington, Asian Bar Association of Los Angeles, Asian American Lawyers Association of Massachusetts, APABA Central Ohio, APABA Colorado, APABA Charlotte, APABA District of Columbia, APABA Georgia, APABA Indiana, APABA Los Angeles, APABA Maryland, APABA Pennsylvania, APABA Silicon Valley, APABA South Florida, APABA Tampa Bay, APABA Virginia, APABA New Jersey, Asian Pacific American Women Lawyers Alliance, Chicago Bar Association, Connecticut Asian Pacific American Bar Association, Connecticut Bar Association, East Asian Lawyers Association, the Federation of Asian Canadian Lawyers, British Columbia, Federation of Asian Canadian Lawyers, Ontario, Filipino American Lawyers of Orange County, Filipino American Lawyers of San Diego, GAPABA, Georgia Asian Pacific American Bar Association, the Institute for Inclusion in the Legal Profession, the Japanese American Bar Association, Michigan Asian Pacific American Bar Association, Greater Orlando Asian American Bar Association, Missouri Asian American Bar Association, NAPABA, NAPABA Hawaii, NAPALSA, National Asian Pacific American Law Students Association, George Washington Law, National Association of Women Lawyers, National Association of Minority and Women-Owned Firms, National LGBT Bar Association and Foundation, the New York City Bar Association, New York State Bar Association Business Law Section, Oregon Asian Pacific American Bar Association, Pan Asian Lawyers of San Diego, the Philippine American Bar Association in Los Angeles, Society of Asian Lawyers, South Asian Bar Association of North America, Southern California Chinese Lawyers Association, and the Tennessee Asian Pacific Bar Association, and our supporters, Asian American Bar Association of Houston, Dallas Asian American Bar Association, Houston Bar Association. Thank you so much for your support in expanding the reach and the volume of this program. If anyone was inadvertently left out, please notify us in the chat and we'll provide a special mention at the end of the program. And now to kick off the program, we have Karen King, and we thank her for her work in being the co-executive editor of the AABANY report. Karen?
Thanks so much, Judy. Again, my name is Karen King. I'm a partner at Morvillo Abramovitz, and it was my great privilege to work with AABANY on the report that was published in February on the very topic we're here to discuss. It was our hope in drafting that report that we would prompt some discussion among our community and to bring attention to this very important issue. So it's my great privilege to be able to introduce our panelists today. Let me start by saying that each of the panelists is joining us in their individual capacity, and their views are their personal views and not the views of the companies at which they work. Our first panelist is Sarah Young Bosco. She is the Senior Vice President, Secretary, and General Counsel at Emerson. Also, we have Sam Kichi, Executive Vice President, General Counsel of Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Becton, Dickinson and Company. Also with us is Sandra Young, Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Bristol Myers Squibb. Then we have Alan Lowe, Vice President and Deputy General Counsel for Products, IP, and Legal Operations at Facebook. Next, we have Susan Moon, Principal Counsel of the Walt Disney Company. And finally, Carolyn Tsai, Chief Legal Officer and Corporate Secretary at Western Union. And with us as the moderator today, we have Michael Wu, who is on AABANY's Advisory Committee. And with that introduction, I'd like to turn this over to Michael to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Karen, Judy, and Sabna. We're so pleased to be joining you today to discuss the important issues of anti-Asian American violence, corporate social responsibility, and what we can do to address these problems. The coronavirus pandemic has become a virus of hate, with significant increases in hate crimes against Asian Americans. Unfortunately, our former president and other politicians have exacerbated the issue by failing to follow the WHO naming convention for diseases, by insisting on calling COVID-19 the Chinese or Wuhan virus, and even worse, Kung flu. On a weekly basis, my family and I see videos and pictures of Asian Americans, especially the elderly, who have been physically assaulted and verbally abused. It's really been disheartening reading about Asian Americans trying to go about their daily lives and being targeted by all races, from the Atlanta spa shootings to a pregnant Asian American woman who was punched in the face in Philadelphia at a crosswalk with her young daughter, and then an 89-year-old Chinese American grandmother slapped in the face and set on fire in Brooklyn. So Sarah, please share some of your thoughts on the intensified discrimination against Asian Americans since the commencement of the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Michael, and hello, everyone. You know, I think it's really appropriate that we're starting this conversation today with talking about kind of where are we? You know, I think being able to document through some of the reports that have been presented and the work by academic institutions is really critical because you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And so it's very important that we are tracking and documenting and really giving visibility to these activities. You know, I really appreciate the work by Stop Asia, AAPI Hate, and the Asian American Bar Association of New York and the other academic institutions. You know, even our president, our current president, has said that silence is complicity. So we can no longer stay silent. You know, what we saw, I think, over the course really since the pandemic and even prior to that, which we'll talk about later, sort of the historical arc of what's going on here, is really the series of attacks, as you mentioned, Michael, that had a clear racial overtone, right? And, you know, we saw lots of, I mean, if you're reading the news every day, then there are incidents as recently as yesterday, I think, that were reported in the New York press about slurs that have been made, violent attacks. You know, you have, you know, kill all Chinese people written on walls. I mean, just really some really unpleasant stuff. So, you know, as COVID happened, and if we could just stay on this slide for a minute, Bonnie. So as COVID had happened and we saw this sort of rise in pandemic related or coronavirus related assaults, you know, then we started getting and misinformation about China, and therefore anybody who was thought to be Chinese. It really created this link between the pandemic and the blame game. And so incidents like you're the ones who infected. There was a woman who was attacked on the subway and said she was diseased when she was wearing a mask, and this was quite early in the pandemic. And lots of comments about you're the ones who brought the virus here. So incidents like that, and as they become more violent, obviously the most tragic, and they're all tragic, but the most tragic was the killing of the 8 persons in Atlanta on March 26th, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent. But of course, that was not the end. 3 days after that incident, there was a very highly visible incident in New York City where a 65-year-old Filipino woman was pushed down and kicked several times in front of an apartment building, where employees of that building were onlooking and yet did nothing. And even this week, as I mentioned, there were other reports of recent incidents that happened really just this last couple of days. You know, I think everybody by now hopefully is aware of the current administration, federal administration position on this. President Biden had visited families and leaders in Atlanta shortly after it happened. He has clearly come out and said that this harassment, assault, killings, et cetera, have to stop, and we have to change, and we can no longer be silent. So, you know, a lot of discussions in legal fields, et cetera, is around, you know, are these hate crimes? Are they something else? You know, the federal definition of a hate crime is willfully causing or attempting to cause bodily injury because of a certain characteristic, be it race, gender, color, national origin, and that you have to show motivation by this bias. some bias. And we should note that all states have enacted their own hate crime definition. So there's clear legislation out there, but it has been difficult to prove. And I think in the past, police have been reluctant, law enforcement has been reluctant to bring hate crimes because of a perceived high bar to bring those actions. The prosecutors will ask, are the victims signal? They have to ask, are they signaled out because of their Asian descent? Would they have attacked someone else if they hadn't been the person there? But what we're seeing, and in the statistics now, if you go to the recent report by the California State Center for Study of Hate and Extremism in San Bernardino, California, hate crimes overall are actually down by about 6% is what the report said. But hate crimes where there is an Asian American or Pacific Islander element has actually exploded by 145%. I think if you had a chance to see, there was an April 3rd New York Times article that really kind of scrolled through the different incidents that had happened and really captured the sense of this tidal wave of incidents that have occurred. And they have documented 110 episodes since March 2020 throughout the country. The FBI, this shouldn't be a surprise. The FBI identified this early on and said at the start of the COVID-19 outbreak that it expected a surge in hate crimes against Asians, largely fueled by rhetoric that we were hearing out of their very high offices in the country. The United Nations issued a report, and even this has also generated an overall perception that there is a greater rise. So perceptions amongst Asians and non-Asians to total 30% overall, and 60% of Asians have actually said that they've actually witnessed an incident where an Asian was blamed for the COVID pandemic. And we're seeing this even, as you can see from the chart here, that from a perception, 58% of Asian adults are actually are saying that they're hearing more, and that the environment has been created where it's now almost acceptable or acceptable to be able to be open about this. So I think that's really creating a very difficult environment. I think that I think the slide came up, but the Stop AAPI Hate, which formed in 2020 to start tracking these incidents, have said that it received over 3,700 reports of hate incidents directed at Asian Americans nationwide. One of the reports I read that in California alone, there are 6 million Asians, and anti-Asian hate incidents in LA County is up 115%, and it's up 1,200% in Orange County. So that just tells you that the level of these kinds of incidents are very critical. I just wanted to end by, first of all, thanking the Asian Bar Association and Paul Weiss for the report that they published. I think that I think we've seen in New York City certainly a skyrocketing of incidents from the early pandemic to as recently as I said this week. I think what probably comes pretty close to all of our hearts, a Chinese American lawyer was attacked and threatened outside her home together with her small child and her husband. And it was caught on social media, and no arrest has been made. So in fact, I think that the AABANY report notes that as of the publication of the report, there have been no prosecutions of any incidents that were claimed in 2020. So that, to me, is a very telling statistic. And I think what's also important, sometimes we just read what's on the press, we look at the video, but we're not even talking about what's going on online, which is a much more nefarious sort of dark environment. And there, what we're seeing is that harassment and hate speech on online social media is extremely aggressive because you can't identify who's seeing them and you don't see who's doing it. and the hate speech is not regulated, it's not being tracked. And so that opens up a whole nother environment, if you will, that further creates this environment where this kind of conduct is not only enabled, but really, I think, screams to all of us for action.
You're so right, Sarah. I have a 15-year-old son, and he's always online, and then bringing his iPad over to me, showing some of this hate speech. Is just disgusting, absolutely disgusting.
It is disgusting. So why don't I conclude my remarks there, Michael, and we can continue the conversation.
All right, thank you so much. So Caroline, the pandemic has disproportionately affected Asian American communities. Can you share some of your thoughts on the impact on our communities as well as diversity within our communities?
Thank you, Michael. The rich tapestry of our diverse community is simply amazing. We represent over 20 different ethnicities, religions, and that's something that really has been really impactful to me as we look at the diversity of our community. But COVID-19's comparatively deep impact on the Asian American community has exposed the gap between perception and reality. The experiences of our community in the United States has been marked by a basic contradiction in the last couple of years. At 20 million strong, we currently comprise nearly 6% of the US population, and Asian Americans are a powerful economic force. We comprise nearly 2 million Asian American-owned small businesses that generates $700 billion in annual GDP, and we employ around 3.5 million people. Asian Americans have been part of this amazing country's history dating back to the 1800s. But despite wide-ranging contributions to our country, we've been historically overlooked, and indeed the common perception of Asian Americans as the model minority, excelling and assimilating, has led many people to not view us as marginalized at all. And this dynamic often excludes Asian Americans from diversity initiatives in corporate America, in law firms, leading to underrepresentation in business and politics, and leaving many of us without support in navigating persistent language barriers. Asian Americans also have some of the widest variances in the legal community, in corporate success and educational attainment, and in income. And the community workers during the pandemic that were disproportionately impacted also hold high contact essential jobs that put themselves at risk during this pandemic. Asian-owned businesses are overrepresented in sectors that have been hardest hit by COVID-19. And in particular, as we think about the frontline workers and the essential workers, this is particularly true in healthcare, where Asian Americans exceed their share of the population in 72% of high contact essential occupations and medical fields. In particular, we know about the incredible contribution of Filipino American nurses. And finally, Asian American personal appearance workers, such as cosmetologists and barbers and those who work in manicure salons. These are another example of the high percentage of Asian Americans serving in the front line. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. All right, Sandy, targeting Asian Americans as a group to blame for the pandemic and anti-Asian American violence is not a new phenomenon. Can you please share some of your thoughts on anti-Asian discrimination historically? Sandy, sorry, you're on mute.
I knew one of us that would happen to one of us, so it happened to me. So hopefully it's the last time it happens during this discussion. Sadly, it's clear that in some of the statements of support for the APPI community and some of the news reports, and even from some of the comments from our friends and colleagues, that many people believe that APPI hate is a recent phenomenon brought on by the pandemic. Many people are surprised to learn that APBI hate, which is expressed in government regulations and brutal acts of violence, has existed since the 1870s, and that the seeds of this were planted with the immigration of Chinese workers in the 1850s with the gold rush and the railroad construction. As the Chinese population grew, there were complaints that the Chinese were stealing jobs from white men, that they were unclean and carried diseases. So it's not surprising that people are unaware of this history, since Asian American history is not taught in our schools. Those of us who are aware of this violent history knew that when people started to talk about the Kung Flu, that violence was inevitable, and we warned against it, but few people listened. And just a year to the date when Trump first tweeted about the Chinese virus, the murders in Atlanta occurred. And Al and I will quickly review some of that history. And I'll start first. Chinese workers who built the western half of the transcontinental railroad were lynched and subject to mob violence during the economic turndown in the late 1880s. In 1871, 19 Chinese immigrants were massacred, and 15 of them died by lynching by a mob in Los Angeles. In 1885, at least 28 Chinese miners were killed, 15 were injured, and 78 Chinese houses were burned down during the Rock Springs massacre, which happened in Rock Springs, Wyoming. So that's one of the earliest incidents of massacre and violence against Asians. And let me turn it over to Alan to talk about the next one.
Yeah, for many people don't realize that COVID isn't the first time that Asians have been scapegoated for a pandemic. When the bubonic plague hit San Francisco, Chinese immigrants were singled out and blamed, and this is back in the 1900s, when a body of a Chinese laborer who was suspected of having died from the plague was found in Chinatown. Authorities immediately quarantined Chinatown with the mayor of San Francisco claiming that Chinese Americans were unclean, filthy, and a constant menace to the public health, only to find out that 3.5 months later that there was no cases of bubonic plague in Chinatown. So, history repeats itself. It happened over 100 years ago, and it shouldn't be a surprise that we've seen it again.
And then the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was enacted in 1882, was the first significant law restricting immigration to the U.S. And the Chinese Exclusion Act was built on the Page Act of 1875, which banned Chinese women from immigrating to the U.S. based on the fear that they were prostitutes and would bring germs and disease to white men. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which prevented Chinese laborers from entering and obtaining citizenship in the US, was also partly justified on the grounds that the Chinese brought a variety of infectious diseases, and as we said before, including bubonic plague, into the US. And it wasn't until 1943 when the act was partially lifted, and in 1965, it was fully lifted.
Perhaps one of the more infamous acts of discrimination by the government was the detention of 120,000 Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II, pursuant to President Roosevelt's executive order. The willingness to abandon the American values was a result of scapegoating motivated by economic, social, and political tension. But probably the biggest legacy of the internment was perpetuating one of the great myths about AAPIs, which is that we are the perpetual foreigner. These were the people who were interned were citizens, they were permanent residents, they were family members of people who were serving in the military for the United States and defending the United States. And so regardless of their status, they were rounded up, placed in crude, cramped detention quarters. And then on top of that, so not only did the executive branch demonstrate this harsh discrimination against AAPIs, you had the Supreme Court also validate it in the Korematsu versus United States case, which upheld the exclusion of the Japanese Americans from the West Coast war area and doing so denied the obvious racial motivations behind it.
And during the economic turndown that hit the US auto industry in the 1980s, Asian Americans were also blamed, scapegoated once again, due to the growing presence of Japanese auto manufacturers in the US at that time. And that scapegoating led to the death of Vincent Chin, who was only 27 at the time he was beaten to death with a baseball bat by two white men who were laid off auto workers in Detroit. Of course, they blamed the recent layoffs in the auto industry on Japanese competition. The two white men were initially charged with second-degree murder, but they were allowed to plea bargain the charges down to manslaughter. And they each paid, as a result, a $3,000 fine and received 3 years of probation, and neither man served any jail time. I think we all remember, well, those of us who are old enough, I guess, to remember the Vincent Chin incident, but it really was a turning point in raising the consciousness of many Asian Americans as to the discrimination and racism we face, regardless of whether we were born here or whether we were Chinese or Japanese or Korean or South Asian or any other Asian ethnicity. It just didn't make a difference to people who were willing to blame and eager to blame Asians for their economic and other misfortunes.
And of course, more recently, we've seen incidents as well in the aftermath of 9/11, the attacks by Al-Qaeda. We saw discrimination against South Asian Americans, Muslim Americans, and Middle Eastern Americans becoming targets of hate and violence based on their appearance, ethnicity, and religious affiliation. 81 hate incidents against South Asians were reported nationwide in just the first week following 9/11. So what Sandy and I wanted to do was just reflect and just show that this isn't new. What we're seeing, there's a history of it that goes back 150 years. But what we've done is just shown some of the more egregious examples of the discrimination. But we know that the history of hate against AAPIs is not always so extreme. And our history actually includes a lot more subtle cases of it, but for many, many years. Recently, I've generally kept my experience with discrimination generally to myself, but shortly after the Atlanta shootings, the AAPI community and Facebook came together to talk and share about their feelings and what they were experiencing. And one of the things that struck me was there was a commonality that nearly everyone who shared experiences had in common, and that was that nearly everyone who had grown up in the United States had experienced some form of bullying as a child in school. And that was something that surprised and struck even me. I mean, I experienced it myself, but to have such a common experience with nearly everyone who shared, this included racial slurs, taunting, being beaten up, being spit on. We had one person share that the person was chased and shot at with a BB gun. Quite sad, quite frankly, and quite traumatic for this entire group of people. And what dawned on, what was surprising to me was that this was true whether or not the person grew up in the 1970s, the 1980s, or the 1990s. And this was true whether they grew up in the East Coast, the Midwest, or the West Coast. So it didn't matter. And these are not incidents you're going to read about. These are not incidents that you're going to find on Wikipedia, but these are pervasive, and these are as much about our history of violence against AAPIs as the other things that Sandy and I talked about.
Yeah, so true, Alan. I mean, I grew up in East Brunswick, New Jersey, Knoxville, Tennessee, Dunwoody, Georgia, and each of these places I was subject to abuse and got in many fistfights just because of all the slurs I encountered frequently. All right, well, thank you, Sandy. We're going to turn it now over to Susan and Sam. What are your thoughts on some of the causes behind anti-Asian American violence in our current environment? After, we've already heard the historical context, but now that we're going through this new influx, what are your thoughts, Susan?
Sure, and thanks, Michael. So definitely, one of the general causes, as you've all been hearing about, in this panel, is that AAPIs are viewed as basically perpetual foreigners. So, society deprioritizes the violence that is happening against AAPIs as less important because they just don't think of it as violence against Americans. And on the contrary, AAPIs are actually left out typically of the cultural conversations in America and are perceived as an other, often perceived and treated as subhuman. So this has resulted as the other panelists have explained, and really historical hostility against AAPIs. This is not new, but it's been increasing. So another very obvious cause, again, kind of touching on what some of the other panelists have talked about, the recent increase, is this overall environment of uncertainty and fear that's being caused by the pandemic. And this has kind of a lot of different components. So, first, there's just if you kind of go back in time to the beginning of the pandemic, there was incomplete and inaccurate information that really kind of reinforced this anti-Asian sentiment. So during the early stages of the pandemic in the US, there was a lot of widespread speculation about the origins of the virus and the ways that it got to the US, how it was spread. There was a lot of uncertainty about that. And so, much of the speculation ended up being blamed on Chinese people. And, more broadly, AAPIs got caught in it for the pandemic. So for example, in New York, there was a staffer of an assemblywoman who shared a social media message. And that said, "We urge citizens to stay away from Chinese supermarkets, shops, fast food outlets, restaurants, and businesses, as most of the owners went back to China to celebrate Chinese New Year. They are returning and some are bringing along the coronavirus." And then flights from China were banned while other international flights remained in operation. There was a study later that was performed by the Mount Sinai Medical School, and it found that the first COVID cases in New York actually came from Europe and American sources, not from China. But that said, a lot of people just quickly sought to blame the Chinese people, and again, Asian Americans as a whole got caught up in this. And social media accounts were just full of posts describing Chinese people as backward, disgusting, dirty, having gross eating practices. So AAPIs were scapegoated because of that. There are also, actions throughout the year by public figures and media, basically intentionally referring to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, the Kung flu, literally crossing out coronavirus and substituting in China virus. And again, tying the blame for the pandemic on China. And by association, encouraging blame on those who look like they're from China, regardless of whether they have any connections to China or not. So also, there was anti-Asian racism and xenophobia that was fueled by rising tensions in Sino-US relations. So, back in May last year, then President Trump, he was referring to this deal that was signed with China in January. And so he said, "It came from China. We're not happy about it. We just signed a trade deal. The ink wasn't dry. And all of a sudden, this floated in. We are not going to take it lightly." So, which, it's kind of crazy. It's like it's like he's saying that, China signed this deal knowing that there was going to be this worldwide pandemic. And the same week that he made that statement in May, the Senate overwhelmingly approved a bill that would bar some Chinese companies from getting listed on US stock exchanges. So that just served to increase a lot of the tensions that were going on during the time and during the rest of the year. So all of this has made this anti-Asian violence become a political issue, actually, when it shouldn't be. For example, March 26th, which became National Stop Asian Hate Day just a month, less than a month ago, 26 governors signed a letter condemning racism, violence, and hatred against our AAPI communities. It wasn't it was basically something that should not have been controversial, but only 2 Republican governors, Maryland and Massachusetts, signed the letter. All of the Democratic governors signed it. The governor of Guam signed it. And it was really, it should not have been something that seemed like a partisan statement. It basically said, "Today and every day, we stand in solidarity and support and shared resolve with the Asian American community." But because of the fact that it's become now more of what's seemingly partisan issue, there are a lot of people who are viewing it that way. And these a lot of people to believe that violence against APIs is okay or even justified, by tying foreign relations to Asian countries like China, which has nothing to do with Asian Americans living in America. The New York Times had a report during the week after Georgia shooting, and it had a report about a messaging app called Telegram. So back in January, a new group had formed in the messaging app, and the group was named after a racial slur. So after the shootings, that group linked to a poll, and in that poll, it said that 84% of those who voted agreed that the violence against APIs was justified retaliation for COVID, so 84%. And granted, this is a group that has joined under racial slur, but it's crazy. There are people out there who believe that we deserve it and Asian Americans deserve it. So now I'll turn it over to Sam, who will discuss a little bit more about cultural and societal causes and stereotypes that contributed to the increase in violence.
Thank you. And we talked about, I think Sandy and Alan talked about the history, and it's an important context because when we talk about stereotypes and biases, those stereotypes and biases have persisted throughout our community's history in this country. And I think, one of the larger stereotypes that has, I would say, been perpetuated by media, we'll talk about that in a second, has been the model minority myth. And the model minority myth, it really takes the diversity of our community that Caroline talked about and puts it in a unidimensional way. It says that here is a community that is, doesn't raise issues, doesn't complain, just works hard and keeps their head down and is relatively compliant. And that model minority myth kind of feeds into some of the cultural issues. So as I think about the causes of this, it's multidimensional. It's the stereotypes that have been perpetuated throughout history. It's one of those stereotypes that is what I would say been normalized through media is the model minority myth. And then you layer on cultural issues that are somewhat common in a relatively diverse community. And those cultural issues, are not necessarily speaking up, not necessarily wanting to complain and raise issues in the community. And when you take those cultural issues and then you wrap them up into an institutional inertia to respond to issues associated with violence against our community, it results often in increased vulnerability, right? So if you have a group of folks that are perceived to be somewhat compliant, not raising issues, not marching, and if you have a perception that the institutions in which are supposed to afford safety and recourse either through law enforcement or through prosecutor's office, and we'll talk about that later in the program, what we can do as a legal community to take action. It continues to perpetuate a vulnerable community that it becomes easy and weak targets in the eyes of some of these perpetrators to target.
If I could also add here, I was a prosecutor in the Manhattan DA's office during the 1980s, where crime was much higher than it is now. And I told during one of our prep sessions about a situation where there were a number of crimes, increasing number of crimes against Asians, particularly in the subways. And I worked with one undercover Chinese officer, transit officer. And whenever he went out undercover, holding the Chinese newspaper upside down and pretending he was inebriated, he would get inevitably pounced on. And I think there's a perception that Chinese people, Asian people in general, don't report crimes. As Sam said, some of it is because of language issues. And I have to admit, whenever I had a Chinese victim, or Asian victim, I was always concerned the person wouldn't come to court. There were language issues, so that's a barrier. People have to take time out of work to report a crime. So that's an issue as well. And so there are all these obstacles for Asians not reporting crimes. And these things are known to defendants, perpetrators of crimes. And that's why I think it makes Asian victims more vulnerable, because some of these criminals count on Asians not reporting a crime and not cooperating with the police and maybe not even speaking English. So these are things that I think all of us can help address.
And you know, Sandy, your experience is really is important in this conversation. And I think when we later on in the presentation, we're going to talk about how we as a legal community can help address some of these institutional issues. And one of the other related issues in all of this, so when you think about the layering of, you've got these historical stereotypes that have persisted, you have the cultural barriers, you have the institution that is supposed to protect the communities and help prosecute. And I think one of the things that is very powerful in this, in perpetuating these issues, is the media. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about that, but the way the media and other ethnic groups have experienced this in different ways in the United States, but the way the media, television, and cinema have portrayed Asian men and Asian women, you know, again, certain attributes that are unidimensional in a very diverse community, very negative perpetuation of some of these stereotypes. As an example, our representation in cinema, I was looking at this data this morning, 1% of leading roles in all cinema occupied by people from our community, but we represent 6% of the population. Similar statistics in television and programming. And so if you're not represented and your representation reflects certain stereotypes and biases, it becomes normalized in society. And then specifically, there's an interesting article just a couple of weeks ago in the New Yorker about the media's portrayal of Asian Americans. The way that they portray Asian American and Pacific Islander women is particularly misogynistic. In a lot of ways, the stereotypes are negative, and it perpetuates this vulnerable, weak, and in some ways a victim no longer being a victim and really being the recipient of blame. So I think a lot of layers to this: the culture, the institutional reporting issues, language issues, and the media's, what I would say, role in perpetuating these long-held stereotypes and biases.
Thank you, Sam.
I'm
never going to forget long.
Can I just say, on behalf of the women on the panel, I think all of us have probably been called Dragon Lady at least once. I don't know about you guys, but I hate that movie Full Metal Jacket because of all of the phrases that come out with that, without Asian women, stereotypes, being prostitutes, and what those words have been repeated to us many times. So Sam, what you say about the media really resonates with me, particularly with respect to the stereotypes of Asian American women. I think all of us have been taunted at one point in our lives with these things, and I see some heads nodding.
Yeah. I mean, I think it cuts through so many different things. I mean, even some of the stereotypes of, why Asian Americans don't occupy certain levels in corporations. There's a disproportionate representation, and it's because, great at X, but maybe not the best leaders. It's, if you really kind of think about it, and I've been doing that a lot lately, you'll see these stereotypes just kind of softly perpetuated, and it becomes normalized. And I think, Sandy, to kind of reemphasize your point, the misogynistic way that movies, television, even just daytime programming, there's some of the subtle stuff, it's problematic. And I think it creates a group that is even more vulnerable to attack than others.
Exactly. The so-called sex addiction of the murderer in Atlanta and his addiction to massages and Asian women. I'm sure the media had no small part in creating that image in his head and causing his so-called addiction.
That's right.
Well, having grown up as a teenager in the 80s with 16 Candles, I will never forget Long Duck Dong and that ridiculous caricature.
Yeah. Well, it's the emasculation of Asian American men. And that's been portrayed in the media just as women have been hypersexualized and fetishized. Yes. So it's the mirror of the other side of that.
Exactly.
And Michael, it goes much earlier than that. I'm older than you. So do you remember Charlie Chan?
Yeah.
And the depiction of him as a detective, this inscrutable, expressionless person. I think it's always been there.
Yes.
And I'll also share a personal story where when I was 20, I used to take the number 7 train with my dad on summertime during breaks to work as a temp in the city. And one day the train stopped, and my dad, who's about 5'8", kind of leaned over. We're all holding on with a packed like sardines, leaned over to see why the train stopped. And this man who was probably like 6'2" or 4", white, started screaming, "What are you doing? Get out of my space," and all the racial slurs. And I'm saying, "Dad, be quiet," in Chinese, just take it, don't say anything, right? I'm 20. And he then proceeded to turn to me and said, "Oh, back when I was stationed overseas, is this your daughter? She's kind of cute. For $5, oh, okay, maybe for $10 I could have her." And he proceeded to then bring his hatred toward me. And I was on one hand relieved that my dad was now safe. On the other hand, it felt so violated. And I didn't actually blame nobody for speaking up, because it was the number 7 train, which was like 60% immigrants going to work. And I remember after the train started going and we were let out in Grand Central and he pushed his way out, my dad was so mad, and all he said was "Mei," which means, you know, I'm the middle child. And he sighed, and I just said, "It's okay, Dad." And we never talked about it again to this day.
So sorry you went through that, Carolyn. It's horrible.
It is just horrible. Yeah.
All right, so over the past decade, investors and companies are increasingly focused on corporate social responsibility. And last year, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, corporate America really reacted in support of Black Lives Matter movement with meaningful support. So to all of our panelists, what can or should companies be doing to help address this anti-Asian American violence and hate crimes? I'll start with Sandy.
Well, you know, just as we had business leaders speak up on the Black Lives Matter movement, I think it's so important that CEOs, not just the head of HR, the head of diversity, speak about it. We need CEOs speaking up, making statements, and being very vocal and loud about that. I know at my company, Bristol Myers Squibb, our CEO put out a statement almost immediately, and but we built this muscle memory based on Charlottesville, based on many things that have happened, that we were able to get that quickly and get the input of our Pan-Asian Network, which is our people and business resource group for Asians and Asian Americans at the company. So that's at a minimum. We've also doubled the charitable contributions that we make to organizations that fight hate. And we had our PAN group identify a few organizations, and we double matched through our foundation contributions made to the organization. We also made sure that we had support for our Asian employees. We met right immediately. I and the executive sponsor, one of my fellow leadership team members, met with the leadership team of our Pan-Asian Network and just had a session to talk about how people were feeling and get their thoughts. I've never seen our employees be more emotive, more cathartic, and really so sad when people talked about the things they endured over many years and just kind of sucked up and held inside. It's kind of the way Caroline did, and that's such a familiar thing. But I also got the sense that it was, people are tired and enough is enough. And we provided resources to them. And the thing that struck me most of what people said was that some employees Asian employees were frustrated that their colleagues hadn't reached out to them, just as they reached out to our African American and Black employees during the George Floyd murder and the aftermath of that. It just didn't occur to people to reach out to their Asian employees, maybe because people don't think of them as being Asian. When you think about it, it's really kind of an insult when people tell us they don't think of us as being Asian, because it means we're one of, you're not one of them, you're one of us, because we consider you white, as if that was a better thing. But that was really hurtful to people. And so we made it a point, and I spoke to our leadership team, our CEO's direct reports, and said, you have to encourage your teams to reach out to their Asian colleagues, because we're really hurting right now. And we should show some compassion. So, I know some other companies have done some great things. I think, Alan, you told us during one of our prep sessions, some of the things that have been going on in Facebook, which has a really high number of Asian employees.
Yeah, Facebook, we in our most recent diversity report, we shared that we have 44% Asians in the company, with whites being 41%. So Asians are the single largest racial ethnic group within the company. And doing what you said, Sandy, is so important. to first offer support to the community within your company. We have people that are hurting, even during Black Lives Matter. I think people don't fully appreciate how people are feeling on the inside, and they only see what they see on the outside. And you know, it's so hard to show up to work when you've got distractions, when you've got other things going on, and to get that support from your colleagues is so important. You know, Sandy, something else you said I think that's really important is for executive leaders to speak up and to make public statements. You know, Sam talked about kind of the normalization of these behaviors, and I think when you have a history where these kinds of behaviors are unchallenged and no one speaks up and says that they're wrong, we internalize, and society basically treats it as that it's okay, and they perpetuate it. And all of these things keep going until someone finally says, this is not okay. And when everyone says this is not okay is when we can change. But it's in terms of Facebook, I mean, there's a lot of mental health resources that our HR team has provided for folks within the company who are feeling challenged. There's a lot of allyship training. One of the things that the company, Facebook, because of the nature of the company, besides the focusing on our internal employees, we spent a lot of time, especially over the past year, because of Black Lives Matter, because of COVID, because of the 2020 election, looking at our own products and services and asking ourselves, where do we fit within sort of this social issue? And Facebook is intended to be a neutral platform, but we also know that it can be used for good, it can be used for harm. So we have groups within the company who are dedicated to focus on, we have a social good group, we have a responsible innovation group. We recently hired a head of civil rights who's building out a group within the company. And I think we're one of probably the first large tech company to be able to have a dedicated function to civil rights. And the purpose of those groups is really to do two things. One is to look to see, are our products and services being used to harm the community? Are people using it in a way to spread hate and to spread racism? And what can we do about that? And so there's a lot of effort right now to make sure that the content that's being posted on Facebook doesn't disseminate that kind of hate. And it's operationally, it's a hard problem to solve, but it is a focus of the company. Then there's the other piece, which is what can we do to help? And, you know, can we do things to actually help the community and make a positive, have a positive lasting impact? And so we're looking at things. Right now, we're exploring a lot of things similar to as we did during Black Lives Matter. And it might be things like supporting Asian-owned businesses. It might be raising awareness and trying to address some of these myths and some of these perpetuating of wrong ideas about Asians. And then it's also about working with our partners. We have advertisers, we have others that are also interested in contributing in a positive way on the platform as well. And so we have folks in our marketing team. Eric Toda is one of the gentlemen who's out there speaking a lot about this issue. So there's a lot of things we're trying to do from a product and services standpoint to make sure we're contributing and addressing issues that are out there.
So I would just like to say, we don't have 40% Asian in our company. We're in the Midwest. We have a completely different profile. So for those of you in the audience who think, okay, I might be one or two people or, you know, a very small group, you know, what can we do, you know, on the individual basis? And I think even as leaders in the company, you know, I think one of the things that I've done, and I have a small, you know, as I think I've shared with the group, we are just starting our own Asia AAPI employee resource group. We don't even have that in place yet, but really trying to share information. Carolyn shared an article with us this morning that was very thought-provoking. I immediately sent it to anybody I knew who might be interested in it, just to show that there are people in your circle, however big it is, that are thinking about these issues, that are reading, keeping up, and trying to educate myself as well as educating others in your group. So if you're part of a very small group and you don't have the resources, you know, there's many things you could do on the individual basis, and hopefully participating in a panel like this also can give you some of those resources that you need. So I just encourage everybody to continue your own education and continue the education of your circle, however big it is.
And now briefly layer in the approach at Western Union. Those who know Western Union, those who know my CEO knows he is one of the most passionate advocates and stands firmly without question against all bigotry, racism, and hatred. So he very quickly put out a statement, and he was one of the only executive team members that knew what had happened to me maybe 7 or 8 months ago in the heat of the pandemic, where while walking in my daily walk, I was spat upon, called chink and gook, and I was by myself. And it's my one kind of peaceful part of the day. And I didn't go out for walks for 2 weeks after that. And then I'm ashamed to say that afterwards, my new routine became put my hair in a ponytail, hide all of my hair in a ski cap, put on a mask, and most importantly, put on a sunglasses so you can't tell I have Asian eyes. And so the weather is beautiful now. You know, the new approach, recently my son bought 6 bare strength mace and said, Mom, you have 2 options. You either take that and you must hold it in your hand, not in your pocketbook, or one of us is, it's like strength in numbers, protection in numbers. Clearly, I chose the mace because I need my peaceful thinking time. But when it happened, he found out about it and he was so upset. He wanted to give me corporate security. I said, no, I'm going to continue to live my life. All to say, that's kind of the context. I have an amazing, supportive leadership team. But more broadly, our Western Union Foundation continues to look at opportunities and which nonprofits we're going to be contributing to. He has also publicly spoken in a recent World Economic Forum about the contributions of these first responders, including these frontline workers that we spoke about, like the Filipino nurses. I just wanted to say one more comment, which is I had a huge learning yesterday. I realized, even preparing for this panel, I've never spoken publicly about it. And part of me was kind of ashamed about it because I've been involved in D&I for 15 years. And it's a lot easier advocating for everyone else. I've been the executive sponsor for the LGBT Pride Group at BMO. I've been the leader for women leadership at Bank of America. And I've been really involved in spearheading ESG initiatives for Western Union, but I never spoke about my own personal community and the comfort zone was with NAPABA, my NAPABA friends. Well, that certainly is a turning point for me now, but I also realized yesterday, because I spoke about it publicly for the first time, and I actually got emotional in front of 100 leaders. And I was shocked by that and kind of, wow, I lost my composure. But what came from that was amazing. People reached out. There are people who have spouses and family members I never knew. They said, thank you, Caroline. You know, thank you for that. And I also realized another thing, which is really important. Here I was the last few weeks kind of on the one hand, amazed by the allyship and support of friends, but then on the other hand, kind of judging those who were silent and saying, you know what, that's not right, because everyone's going through their own journey, just like each of us on this panel are going through our own journey, what we're comfortable talking about, they in turn are going through their journeys. They don't know what to say, right? So that's something to keep top of mind. We just have to build resources, make sure that the communication channels are open, and most importantly, building awareness, because I think that's going to move it down.
Maybe I could just, oh, sorry, Susan, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sam.
I'll defer to you and then I'll follow.
Okay, one thing I wanted to mention about, you know, having all of these awareness moments and training and education that, you know, a lot of companies are starting to build internally is to make sure that, I guess, the senior leadership and D&I they really understand that a lot of this burden is going to fall on diverse employees. Unfortunately, to lead a lot of the effort, to train, to help educate, to connect with, you know, AAPI nonprofits. And so a lot of the diverse employees are ending up not only being traumatized by all of the AAPI violence going on and being afraid to go outside, but they're also ending up having to do a lot of extra work, you know, whether it's at the company or outside the company. And so it ends up increasing a lot of extra workload. And I think it's really important for senior leadership to understand that and actually give credit for that. And there are also a lot of companies that are starting to actually tie involvement in DE&I to performance and compensation. So that's another thing that a lot of companies can consider and work on.
So what, just to, not to add more to what was already said, but when I think about a large company, it's a lot easier. So we've got 70,000 associates, and I think the toolkit that most large companies have followed is the tone at the top. So you have the CEO statement, and our CEO made a statement very early. I think what we're trying to do is create community among our associate resource groups. And there's been a lot of dialogue, fireside chats. Now the associate resource groups are talking to each other about this issue. We've certainly made investments in different organizations. And one of the things that we're trying to emphasize, in addition to the mental health resources, because I think the mental health resources have been, even without this issue, the pandemic has created an incredible mental health resource issue in the general population. And then you layer this on top of it, it's extremely profound what I think our community is going through. But one of the things we're talking about is how do you sustain this awareness, and how do you sustain the communities talking to each other and building community? And we don't have an answer for that yet. I think we're really looking for the employee resource groups to help us with that. It's a topic that's top of mind now, but a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, how do you continue to do the work that helps our community and helps not just our community within the company, but also our broader community? And I think, Sarah, you mentioned what we can do as individuals, and I would tell you, I would offer people on the call here that are not in large companies, anytime you need to reach out to me or to any one of us, whatever help that you need, connecting you to resources that we may have, to events we may be holding, I think that's power in this community to help the companies that are maybe smaller than some of the larger companies that are represented on the panel.
Well, that's a good segue for our last question, Sandy, just in terms of the role of the APA legal community and the legal community at large. What role can we all play?
Yeah, so let me, I know we want to get to a Q&A, so let me just cover this quickly. The outpouring of support from the Asian American community has been amazing. The Alliance for Asian American Justice has been established, and that was a group again by Don Liu, Ivan Fong, Alan C., and others. And they're working, we're calling the National Pro Bono Initiative. They're working with NAPABA as well as ALDEF to ensure that all violent anti-Asian actors are brought to justice. So they're coordinating with law firms on a pro bono basis to have them to provide resources by behalf of victims, whether that means working with district attorney's office or prosecution, make it easier for people to go to court, and with ALDEF and others maybe providing translation services. That's really important work, in addition to potentially working on civil litigation against the wrongdoers. So I think that's a really great and important initiative. Also on April 1st, hundreds of Asian American business leaders signed an open letter and put out a full page ad in the Wall Street Journal about anti-APPI hate, and they pledged $10 million to the Asian Pacific Fund. I know many of us on this panel signed on to that initiative too, and that was a very visible open letter that you see on the screen here. So that I thought that was very good, and the commitment, the pledge was also great. There's also the National AAPI Violence Prevention and Response Initiative, which is a Georgia APABA initiative to support victims of anti-Asian American violence. So these are just examples of how the Asian American legal community has gone together. I know there are questions about what we can do as individuals, and as we talked about throughout this panel, I think we have a moment of time in history here. We always are. I think the human tendency is to look for the silver lining in every tragic situation, and we haven't seen, I think, a more tragic situation that we're seeing now. I'm also reminded the quote, I think that's attributed to Winston Churchill, that there's no point in wasting a crisis. I think we are in a crisis situation right now with the rise of anti-AAPI hate, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to band together, to do our part individually or collectively in groups. We have to turn the emotion and the anger that we feel right now into action. And so we can't squander this opportunity. It's really important that we work within our companies, we work as individuals, and we take leadership roles, and we speak loud and we speak often on this topic and educate people on anti-API hate. And I think it's an opportunity for us to take action on a more collective basis. There is a shocking lack of Asian Americans in the Biden administration, and that's got to change. You know, there is still a shocking lack of AAPI judges on both state court and federal levels, and that's got to change. So this is a time that cries out for leadership, and I hope that all of us who are attending on this panel and listening to this panel take this as a call to action to look into what you can do as individuals, what organizations you could help with, and what you could do on your own basis to make some change and not squander this opportunity. I know I keep saying that, but I really feel so strongly that we have to take advantage of this moment, this unique moment in time.
Yeah, terrific, Sandy. I really feel this is an inflection point, and I think we need your leadership in helping Asian Americans address some of these significant problems we're facing at this time. And well, would you consider taking a leadership position in our community, such as serving as the next president-elect of NAPABA?
No, you know, it's funny that because I have been thinking about that, and I've been, you know, all of us say, I'm so busy, I have my main job, it's my work, but, you know, I feel so compelled right now and so moved by everything that we're facing in our community that I would love to run for president-elect of NAPABA. And if and by running, I hope to do the best job possible to continue the great work
that is music to my ears.
That would be amazing.
For all of us to get together and really push this moment in time, this inflection point to the point where it should be, and continue to work together and really make sustainable change where it needs to be made. And let's really work together, really, and have. So I would love to run.
Well, Sandy, I met you the first time at the very first NAPABA convention I ever attended in Atlanta, maybe 10 years ago, and you changed my life. Your generosity. No, honestly, you were the dream and inspiration. So I'm actually awed by and so thrilled to hear this.
Oh, Caroline, thanks so much. I'm really touched, and you know, if I should be so privileged to be named elected president-elect, I would vow to just put my entire heart and soul into this. I love working. NAPABA is a great organization. I love working with everyone that I've met. It's been so much fun to work on this panel together. I didn't know everyone on this call, but together, I think that we really had a bit of a bond here. So and thank you, Michael, for putting us together, and all the people behind the scenes, Bonnie, Jennifer, Sandra, Yamate Yang. I mean, it's just a great community, and there's so much more we can do together.
Well, Sandy has come down to Georgia multiple times to speak to NAPABA. There's a Women's Leadership Network panel. She was our keynote speaker for one of our galas, and so many people have complimented her on what a role model she is for the APA community.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, and now we're going to address to the Q&A. We're going to move to the Q&A session, and let me look at some of these questions. Okay, here's a question for the panelists. I've seen the word xenophobia attached to anti-Asian American hate going on. And while this is part of it, it's not all of it. There's also a white supremacy part of the argument, because it's not just being from another country. Any comments from the panelists?
Yeah, I saw Peggy make that comment, and that she's so right on. This is not just about being out, from outside America anywhere. It's really about being Asian American, Black and brown, as opposed to being from, from countries that are from Europe or, places where there are more white people. So yeah, historically, the Chinese Exclusion Act, first federal law to exclude a group of people by race. And as far as I know, I don't know of any laws that are excluding, an entire race of white people. So I think she's very, Peggy, that was such a great point to mention that there is definitely a white supremacist element to this.
Yeah, and I think the way that I think about it is if you look different, if you talk different, you know, coming from as an immigrant myself, if your parents dress differently, if your food is different, everything that's different about you, that's you know, you're a target in some ways. And that's what I associate with xenophobia, is as opposed to embracing those differences, right, and try to seek to understand those differences become sometimes a focal point for hatred.
Well, Sam, I remember in first and second grade bringing my mom's Chinese food in a thermos, and I was definitely a target because of the food, even though it was delicious food. All my classmates were targeting because of the Chinese food.
Yeah, I remember my mom picking me up at school, and in the mid 70s, when you're wearing a sari and you have the bindi, that now it's somewhat a little bit more, it's more accepted, but in the 70s, mid 70s, it wasn't. So I would try to kind of hide and say, why don't you park down the block? I'll come walk and meet you.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I think we've all had those kinds of experiences of just our culture, the diversity of our cultures and how it's experienced here. The differences become maybe not as well received.
Right.
Yeah, and that's not to say that there haven't been white groups historically that haven't faced discrimination. There definitely have, like when the groups of Irish people came over,
Italian,
Jewish.
Italians.
So yeah, but more recently, it's definitely much more focused on people who are of color.
All right, here's a question. For those of you who work in organizations that have fewer Asian Americans, what's your focus in terms of combating this issue? Is it building allyship? I think, Sarah, you had addressed this earlier, but any other thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think allyship is critical for when you're in a smaller group and finding those allies that can make your group larger. I wanted to take the opportunity to call out the Missouri Asian American Bar Association because they co-sponsored a discussion with 3 other affinity bar associations in St. Louis to create a panel where they could talk about colorism and racism in partnership with the Hispanic Bar Association and Mound City Bar Association, the South Asian. So our smaller, AABA group was able to have a larger forum by joining up with these other groups, and I think it's really critical. Something similar happened where we had a state legislator recently refer in a legislative session. Referred to the flu as the Chinese flu. And immediately, Missouri Asian Bar Association, together with other affinity groups, immediately put out a statement and called them out on it. So you need that larger voice to get attention. And I think allyship is really important, whether it's within your own company or in external resources. And really benchmarking and liaising with other companies is also very, very helpful. In a smaller town like St. Louis, you have an opportunity to know more people. I mean, it's a smaller group, but you have an opportunity to meet more people in a similar situation. So there's definitely opportunity for us.
Great. I'll do one more question. Can the panel please address the issue where diversity initiatives focus on other minorities and often exclude Asian Americans?
Yeah, I have to say that we've experienced this at my company too, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement, where my company set representation goals for Hispanic and Latinos and for Blacks and African Americans, but Asians were excluded. And the explanation was, and this is about one, that we had a large number of Asian Americans already in executive ranks, but that doesn't mean that Asians don't have issues that need to be addressed by companies. So I think it's really important that we as Asian leaders speak up at our companies. The inclusion in a workplace goes beyond representation, the sheer numbers of Asians in certain roles. It really goes to a real sense of inclusion in the company and having the types of roles that are roles of true influence and leadership in the company. So it really, and I think we just have to be much more vocal about that. And the more Asians we have who are willing to speak up in companies and take personal risk, because to some degree you take personal risk when you speak up. It's important that we do that. The more people speak up, the quicker we'll be able to address these issues. But we also have to remember, it's not, diversity shouldn't be a zero-sum game. We can't, we go into a divide and conquer thing, and that's why allyship is even more important with our other groups, with African Americans and with Latinos and Hispanics. So we have to at least speaking to the other groups and making sure that we understand what we can't be used as a wedge against the other groups, which has historically happened.
I agree with speaking up. When I was general counsel of one of my prior companies at a leadership team meeting, one of my fellow leadership team members was commenting how tricky the Chinese are. And so I called them out in front of the whole leadership team. Obviously I was the only minority on the leadership team, but I called him out and he apologized.
This is certainly an issue in tech companies because, and as I mentioned, Facebook has a high percentage of Asians. And so the DE&I group doesn't necessarily see Asians as a problem, as a minority group that needs any attention. But what I would point folks to is the research that's been and reports that have been produced by Ascend, which is a nonprofit organization for Asian professionals. They've done a lot of research and looked into what are the challenges based on the data that Asians are experiencing within companies. And one of the things that they did was they produced what they call a parity index. And so when you look at sort of the proportion of managers versus individual contributors, when you look at the proportion of executives versus individual contributors, is it proportional? So even if your numbers are big or small, if you've got 30% individual contributors, but only 5% at the executive level, you know that there's a problem. And across all four races, Asians were the worst. And when you took into account gender, male versus female, males were better than females, but being Asian was the worst. And of course, if you were an Asian female, you got the double whammy, and you were had the lowest chances of being promoted to either middle management or senior executive. So there are ways to frame the problem to make it something that becomes a priority within the company.
All right, thank you. Terrific. Thank you, everyone. I've got to turn it now over to Judy for more CLE instructions.
Okay, thank you, everyone. As a reminder to attendees who are seeking CLE credit, fill out two forms, the affirmation and the evaluation forms. The affirmation was shared in the link, and you will have received them by email as well. Write in 2 necessary codes. We are getting forms without the codes, and return them to CLE@AABANY, AABANY.org. AABANY is working with the co-sponsoring bars in various states to coordinate getting you certificates in your state. And if you need self-study accreditation, thank you for attending and sharing this information in your networks.
Judy, thank you. I'm Terry Shen. I'm the president of AABANY. So, just to kind of say a few concluding remarks. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this event. It took a lot of people, a lot of thought and effort to pull it together, and I think it was very worthwhile. I want to wrap this up by addressing a couple of questions that we get a lot at AABANY. You guys have seen the Stop AAPI hate statistics earlier in the presentation, so the numbers nationwide are astronomical. Beneath those numbers, you'll see that about 10% of all of these reported incidents are in the New York metropolitan area. So, in many ways, we are dealing with a disproportionate number of these problems. That puts AABANY at ground zero, so to speak, of the issue. And so, in our accumulated experience, we get asked a lot. You guys have heard all of the problems, all of the issues, the causes, the impact. So what can we do about it? I get asked this questions by individuals. I get asked this question by firms and by other organizations. And from what we can tell, from the learning that we've gathered, from the experience that we've had in all the problems that we've been dealing with in the New York metropolitan area, it comes down to two aspects, right? One is what can we do at the institutional level? And secondly, what can we do at the individual level? So institutionally, the core of it is civic engagement. You know, AABANY has testified in front of New York City Council a couple of times. We've engaged in dialogues with the New York Police Department. We have ongoing discussions with the New York City District Attorney's offices, and we've made countless media appearances. I mean, there's been a period of time when we were in front of the media 3 or 4 hours a day. We've been inundated with requests to address this national crisis, and we're also putting out public service announcements in various forms, pamphlets, educational materials, you know, viral videos that will, you know, help people understand what to do if they're impacted by you know, Asian hate crimes. You know, individuals can also participate at the institutional level, diversity organizations, community outreach, education, even local schools, and as we've heard during this discussion, workplace affinity groups. And how we choose to engage, it's, you know, it's a very personal question, right? And that's one of the questions that we have a hard time answering people directly on. It comes down to, you know, everybody thinking for themselves, you know, what's the best way for me to engage? I mean, I give you a couple of my own personal examples. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I was asked to speak alongside Summit Mayor Nora Redist. You know, Summit, New Jersey is the town that I live in. Summit Chief of Police Andrew Bartolotti was also there. You know, we addressed a group of over 400 local residents in a Summit Community Programs event. I've also shared the podium with Congressman Tom Malinowski. He's a New Jersey House of Representatives member. You know, and obviously I'm the president of AABANY. So we sort of all ask ourselves, you know, what's our opportunity to engage in civic engagement? One of the ways that we've seen, as being effective is local government and law enforcement, you know, across the country have all, you know, done the correct public statements of support, right? When addressing Asian hate crime publicly. What we've also seen, you know, in AABANY's experience is that, you know, it's still not a great response beyond that, right? And in large part, it's because local government and law enforcement, they're still trying to understand the problem. So you know, our leaders, our members are discussing with leaders in local government and law enforcement about taking tangible actions to demonstrate their commitment to stopping Asian hate crimes. Now I'm going to switch to the individual level. Okay, so each of us as an individual, as a street level person, you know, what do we do about this? You know, again, AABANY has, fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of experience in this area. For those of you who live in the New York City metropolitan area, you're obviously familiar with the phrase "see something, say something," right? That's a slogan that's plastered all over. You know, any subway train you ride in will have a "see something, say something" ad. It's the same. You know, it's the same thing for, you know, what happens if we as an individual either experience a hate crime or witness a hate crime. You know, if your reflexes are fast enough, take out your phone. Consider your own safety, but flip on a video recording. You know, a substantial number of perpetrators are arrested because of videos. It greatly increases the chances of bringing justice to the situation. We've also seen a reluctance of some victims to come forward and report. And part of that is a problem with the system. You know, when we debrief some victims, we often hear that going through the process of reporting is very traumatic for them. The system doesn't make it easy for them to contribute, you know, what they experienced into the overall solution for the problem. But nonetheless, you know, we as individuals, should encourage the reporting of hate crimes, because the statistics are collected, and even if the police, can't do anything for you individually, because quite frankly, the odds are still stacked against prosecution of hate crimes. These statistics will allow organizations like us to effectively engage at the institutional level and advocate loudly for this mission. These statistics are invaluable for letting organizations like us do our job. And lastly, I want to note to people that, despite the fact that, what I just said, reporting to the police is sometimes a very difficult proposition for victims. At AABANY, we've also been engaged at the federal level with law enforcement. We have a direct hotline to Supervisory Special Agent Chris Donahue of the FBI in New York. From our discussions with the FBI, the FBI has a new leader now, right? Joe Biden was on the podium publicly denouncing anti-Asian hate crimes. And so the federal infrastructure has picked up on that cue. So when we talk to the FBI, they very much welcome our input. They very much welcome any information that we're willing to provide. And they seem enthusiastic in working with us to try to doing what they can at the federal law enforcement level to help the national crisis. So with that, again, I want to thank everybody for participating with us this afternoon. I have to emphasize again, this is a national crisis. There are over 70 organizations that co-sponsored this with AABANY, and we're grateful for the national support. And we hope that we can, use this opportunity when we all have the megaphone to advocate for what's right and to advocate for effective solutions. Thank you.